Kevin Hart arrived on the set of the talk show with his usual confident stride, his smile flashing across the cameras as the audience erupted in applause. Yet beneath that charm there was an undercurrent of tension brewing. For days leading up to the interview, the producers had teased a fiery exchange was inevitable, and from the very first moment the comedian settled into his chair across from Whoopi Goldberg, the energy in the studio shifted. Kevin leaned back, crossing his arms with the kind of playful defiance that hinted he was ready for battle, and Whoopi met his posture with a narrowed gaze, a host who had spent decades commanding stages and couches, never afraid to confront her guests head on. The crowd sensed something unusual, as if laughter and confrontation were about to collide on national television. Kevin began speaking about his career, his grind, his relentless hustle in Hollywood, but each time he tried to steer the conversation toward triumph and humor, Whoopi interrupted with probing questions about controversies, moments he might have preferred to leave untouched. Kevin chuckled at first, his trademark high-pitched laugh filling the air, yet the laughter was thinner than usual, brittle even, because every time Whoopi pressed deeper the mask of charm slipped little by little. The audience leaned in, not with relaxed amusement but with the fascination of people watching a storm take shape right in front of them. No one could have predicted that this opening exchange would spiral into one of the most unforgettable live television confrontations in recent memory. As the applause from the opening faded, Kevin adjusted his jacket and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on his lap, his smile beginning to falter as Whoopi pushed harder on the sensitive topics she asked about, past controversies, about statements that had once placed him in the center of public storms. And although Kevin had rehearsed polite responses, her tone left no room for rehearsed charm. He tried to keep his energy light, tossing out jokes hoping to ease the growing weight in the air, but the jokes landed flat, met with scattered laughter from the audience rather than the roaring approval he was accustomed to. Kevin glanced toward the producers as if seeking rescue, yet none came. The cameras stayed fixed, capturing every flicker of discomfort, every tightening of his jaw. Whoopi did not relent, her voice steady and deliberate, her words slicing through his defenses. She spoke about accountability, responsibility, and the difference between public image and private actions. Kevin cleared his throat, trying to regain ground, insisting he had learned from his mistakes, but Whoopi countered quickly, suggesting that learning meant more than words. It meant humility, it meant vulnerability, and that was not something she felt from him in that moment. Kevin straightened in his chair, his eyes flashing with defiance, and the crowd murmured, sensing the collision course intensifying. The tension was no longer subtle, it was thick enough to silence even the staff moving in the background. Everyone in the studio realized they were no longer witnessing a light-hearted talk show, they were witnessing a raw confrontation that was about to break into something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. Kevin shifted in his seat, his voice rising slightly as he declared that he had already paid his dues to the public, that he had apologized and moved on. But Whoopi leaned forward, her hands pressed firmly on the table as she reminded him that the impact of words could not be erased with a single statement. She pressed further, asking whether his apologies had been rooted in genuine understanding or in damage control. Kevin let out a strained laugh, shaking his head and claiming that people loved to see him dragged down, that the media had feasted on his mistakes for too long. His tone mixed frustration with defensiveness, the audience reacting with uneasy silence. Whoopi responded calmly yet firmly, saying that growth required listening, not deflecting, that real accountability meant facing the discomfort without retreating into humor. Kevin's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as though he had been challenged to a duel, and he fired back with a monologue about resilience, about rising above criticism, about refusing to let others define his legacy. But even as his words echoed with conviction, the tension in his body betrayed the storm within. Whoopi interrupted again, telling him that resilience without humility was arrogance. The audience gasped at her bluntness. Kevin's voice sharpened as he replied that he had worked harder than anyone to earn his place, and that no one, especially not a talk show host, had the right to question his integrity. The clash of words filled the studio with the heat of unspoken truths, the kind that burned brighter under the unforgiving glare of live television. The tension rose higher as Kevin leaned forward, his voice carrying sharper edges, now cutting through the heavy silence of the studio. He spoke of his upbringing, of battles fought long before Hollywood ever knew his name, of the sacrifices that had molded him into the relentless performer he had become. Yet even as he painted his story with passion, Whoopi did not soften her gaze. She acknowledged his struggle but insisted that hardship did not excuse harm. Her words, delivered with calm precision, struck at the heart of his argument. Kevin forced a smile, but it carried none of the warmth that usually disarmed critics. His laughter returned, yet brittle like glass, threatening to shatter with each syllable he accused Whoopi of twisting his narrative of seeking conflict rather than conversation, and though his tone was playful, the bitterness lingered underneath. The audience shifted uneasily, caught between admiration for his fire and discomfort with his defensiveness. Whoopi clasped her hands together, her voice steady as she reminded him that her duty as a host was not to flatter but to challenge, and Kevin snapped back, declaring that challenge was one thing but disrespect was another. His words fell heavy, their weight rattling the air. Kevin leaned back, crossing his arms again, his body language screaming defiance while his eyes scanned the audience, searching for validation. The applause was hesitant, the room was divided, the atmosphere electric with the sense that something irreversible was unfolding on live television. Kevin's voice grew louder, now echoing across the studio with a force that surprised even those accustomed to his energy. He declared that he was tired of being painted as the villain, that he had built his career on perseverance, not scandal, and that he would not allow anyone to diminish that legacy. Whoopi responded with unflinching calm, saying that the measure of a man was not in how high he climbed but in how he carried himself when questioned. Kevin clenched his fists against his knees, his face tightening as though every word she spoke was a challenge to his very identity. He tried once more to joke, throwing in a line about how comedians were supposed to be untouchable, but the laughter did not come. The silence from the audience struck harder than any heckler could. Whoopi reminded him that comedy was powerful but that power carried responsibility, her words framed with the authority of experience. Kevin shook his head, insisting that people always demanded perfection while forgetting that he was human. Yet even in that moment his defiance overshadowed his vulnerability. The crowd watched as his shoulders stiffened, his eyes flashing with a mix of pride and wounded pride. The clash between him and Whoopi had transcended entertainment. Now it was raw truth against raw ego, a battle unfolding without script or safety net, and the realization began to spread that this confrontation would not end with polite smiles or staged reconciliation. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every twitch of Kevin's expression as he leaned forward, his tone shifting from defensive humor to heated passion. He declared that the world loved to criticize successful people, that his every move was picked apart under a microscope while others were allowed to make mistakes quietly. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through, unwilling to reveal weakness. Whoopi listened intently, her posture unshaken, before calmly replying that criticism came with influence, that when one reached the heights he had achieved, scrutiny was inevitable and often deserved. Kevin shook his head in disbelief, claiming that he was constantly forced to apologize for being ambitious, for being outspoken, for refusing to bow down. Whoopi countered that ambition was admirable but accountability was unavoidable, and the audience let out a collective murmur at her firm delivery. Kevin slapped the armrest lightly, his energy vibrating through the set, his words firing rapidly, now about the endless nights of work, the sacrifices of family time, the pain of setbacks that few ever saw. He insisted that people like Whoopi should understand, but instead she only fueled the fire. Whoopi raised her hand, gently stopping his tirade, and told him that understanding was not the same as excusing, that to truly grow he would have to accept hard truths and not deflect them. Kevin's face hardened, the silence stretched thin across the room, the sense of imminent eruption filling every corner of the stage. Kevin sat back, his chest rising and falling with quick breaths, his eyes locked on Whoopi with an intensity that filled the studio. He told her that he was done letting people tear him down, that his journey had been built on resilience, and that no one, not even her, could rewrite his story. The audience gasped at his sharp tone, some leaning forward in anticipation, others whispering nervously. Whoopi remained composed, her calmness a sharp contrast to his rising storm. She reminded him that rewriting his story was not the goal, that facing uncomfortable truths was part of evolution. Kevin shook his head, dismissing her words, saying that he had faced more than enough challenges to earn respect and he would not let another television moment define him. His voice cracked again, but he quickly covered it with a forced laugh that carried no joy. The silence from the crowd pressed against him, and in that silence his anger swelled further. He pointed out that he had fought too hard for too long to be belittled on live television. Whoopi answered softly that no one was belittling him, that accountability was not the enemy but a form of strength. Kevin smirked bitterly, leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed tight across his chest. The cameras caught the flicker of conflict in his eyes, a mixture of pride, pain and defiance, and everyone knew the clash was moving beyond conversation into a full-scale showdown. Kevin leaned forward again, his voice steady but laced with fire, as he told Whoopi that the only reason people kept questioning him was because he refused to fit neatly into the box they had built for him. He said he had broken barriers, he had inspired millions, and yet he was still treated like his past defined him more than his present. The audience sat in silence, their faces tense as if waiting for an explosion. Whoopi calmly reminded him that breaking barriers came with responsibility, that inspiration meant little if it was shadowed by unresolved issues. Kevin shook his head, his jaw tight, his words spilling out faster as he accused her of using the show to create A spectacle of him he said he had come to uplift and entertain, but instead he was being attacked. Whoopi interrupted firmly, her voice carrying authority as she said that honest conversation was not an attack, it was truth. Kevin clenched his fists, his body rigid with frustration, his eyes darting to the crowd as though searching for allies. The scattered applause that followed Whoopi's remark only fueled his anger. His smile returned, but it was sharp and cold, a mask hiding the storm raging inside. The energy in the room shifted further. The audience no longer relaxed, they were witnesses to a confrontation teetering on the edge of chaos. Kevin pressed his lips together and the silence that followed felt like the calm before a breaking wave. Kevin's voice rose higher, now echoing with raw frustration as he declared that he had earned his place through sacrifice, through endless hours on stage and screen, through battles most people could never imagine, and he would not allow anyone to question the depth of his journey. The audience responded with scattered applause, yet many faces carried unease. Whoopi leaned in, her tone calm yet firm as she reminded him that greatness did not mean immunity, that even legends had to confront their flaws. Kevin shook his head with a bitter smile, saying that people like her always moved the goalposts, that no matter how much progress he made someone would drag him back into the past. His words tumbled fast, filled with both passion and resentment, his body restless, his hands gesturing sharply. Whoopi kept her composure, her voice a steady anchor as she explained that refusing to look back was not strength but avoidance. Kevin laughed dryly, a sound without joy, insisting that the world wanted to see him broken but he would never break. The cameras caught the glimmer of anger in his eyes, his chest rising heavy with each breath. The silence that followed was heavy, the audience torn between admiration for his conviction and discomfort with his defiance. The air thickened every second, pulling the moment closer to a breaking point that no one could stop.